Welcome back to New World Next Week. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com. You're a liar. You suck. But first, U.S. complains as Russia bombs its terrorists. Perhaps we need a little background from the New York Times first, James. Russians strike targets in Syria, but not ISIS areas. This published today, October 1st, as I come to you. And Russian aircraft carried out a bombing attack against Syrian opposition fighters on Wednesday, including at least one group trained by the CIA, eliciting angry protests from American officials and plunging the complex sectarian war into dangerous new territory. Russia's entry into the Syrian conflict, foreshadowed by a rapid military buildup in the past 3 weeks at an airbase in Syria, makes the possibility of a political settlement in Syria more difficult and creates a new risk of inadvertent incidents between American and Russian warplanes flying in the same area. And it adds a powerful but unpredictable combatant to a civil war that has already resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths and a flood of refugees. So we'll move and pivot a little bit to an article from Tony Cartalucci. U.S. complains as Russia bombs its terrorists, and he notes that New York Times article that we just read, the first couple of paragraphs for you, attempts to frame Russia's recent actions in Syria as dishonest and dangerous, and it reports, as we just noted for you, and again, everything is linked up as we always cite and source everything for you down in the show notes. This, of course, would only make Russia's actions dishonest or dangerous if groups trained by the U.S. CIA were, in fact, moderates. The U.S. claims that they are. However, of course, they're not. And thus, Russia's actions are duly justified, as is the expansion of their current policy for months now, after years of headlinings confirming the U.S. has been covertly arming militants in Syria for the purpose of overthrowing the government in Damascus, a narrative revolving around tens of thousands of these militants defecting to al-Nusra, the so-called Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, IS, whatever you like, has been peddled to the public by the Western media and U.S. politicians to account for the apparent failure of America's alleged policy of creating an army of moderates to both fight ISIS/Al-Qaeda and the Syrian government. In reality, James, from the beginning, there were never any moderates, starting as early as 2007, years before the Syria war kind of got hot. The U.S., as a matter of policy, had long since decided to intentionally fund and support the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, for all intents and purposes, the sort of political wing of al-Qaeda, if you will, and began arming militants affiliated with al-Qaeda itself. 2007, James, that's around the time that you and I really got into doing the work that we've been doing, and we've been doing New World Next Week since 2009. And we have covered this, I think, time and time again. And I'll throw it back to you and note that you have just written a piece about the real blowback in Syria in your International Forecaster.
Yeah, and the blowback isn't, oops, look at that, we accidentally created this Islamic State. No, the blowback is now the Russians, the Chinese, Iran, Hezbollah are coming together to form an actual military alliance that is actually going to target the terrorists in Syria and Iraq, which, of course, is anathema to the United States because Russia is bombing Al-Qaeda. So, of course, the U.S. is going to be angry about it. And I was just reflecting to myself yesterday, watching the propaganda roll out about these Russian strikes, that for someone who's been involved in this for the last 8 years with the website and dissecting this propaganda on a daily basis, it takes a lot to kind of knock me from my horse again, but it is just so amazing. I know that the corporate mainstream press has been controlled since a century and a half ago with Hearst and, then the JP Morgan interests and whatever, buying up newspapers all across the country to serve their propaganda interests. But still, I have to wonder if it has ever been so blatant, the control over the media and the way that this is rolling out, because exactly as you would expect, finally someone is actually bombing these terrorists in Syria and Iraq. Amazing, but of course they have to frame it in a bad light, so they're going to throw out every trick in the book to try to make it look like this is some kind of crazy, unbelievable action, despite the fact that Russia has actually been invited by the Syrian government to do this, unlike the US and its partners. So this is, it's just, in one sense, it's funny to watch this rolling out. In another, it's amazing to see how brazen the propaganda is. Just one example of which that I'll throw out there. I recently retweeted Syricide who was responding to a tweet by the White Helmets, this Soros-linked group of independent journalists in Syria, that talked about Russia strike in Homs today, 33 civilians killed, because now civilians killed in airstrikes is a big news story. Of course, it isn't when the U.S. and its partners are doing it, but now it's, every time Russia bombs anything, there's going to be reports like this. But they illustrated that tweet with a photograph that Syricide pointed out, oh, look at that, it's the exact same girl being held by the exact same man in the exact same position, wearing the exact same clothes as 5 days ago, when this photo was originally retweeted before the Russian airstrikes. So they're already putting out all of this ridiculous propaganda because Russia is bombing Al-Qaeda. That's what this boils down to. Please do read through that Cartolucci article in its entirety, because it has all of this backstory in it and how there is no such thing as moderate opposition, and all of this is just hand-wringing over the fact that something is actually being done to take out this terrorist boogeyman.
And what's Al-Qaeda but something created to go against Russia? It's just the more things change, the more they stay the same. James, you're talking about propaganda. How about this? BBC suggests nuclear destruction of Russia might be necessary, and a couple of other relateds, James, just for the war whores. New patch, the military patch the U.S. troops wear. They're going to be fighting in ISIS. Looks exactly like the ISIS logo. It's pretty awesome. You should lay your eyes on that. And Saudi Arabia will be heading the key human rights panel. So, James, a lot happened at the UN in the last week, and a lot of people are going to die because there's going to be more war and more lies surrounding Syria, just like we've talked about with the Saudis getting into it and more. But I think something that's also going to affect everyone, and that can affect all of us kind of somewhat sitting comfortably at our computers right now, and that's called global goals. The alt media has been on top of this for a while. I know I've had people kind of tweeting this at me for a long time, but this was, I think, kind of its big coming out party with bells and whistles and music and fanfare. The United Nations launches their 2030 Agenda Blueprint for a United World, and we'll take this from Activist Post. Have you heard of the global goals? And if you hadn't, you're going to hear of them by now because they've laid it out. The United Nations launched a set of 17 ambitious goals that it plans to achieve over the next 15 years. The formal name of this new plan is the 2030 Agenda, but those behind it decided that they needed something catchier to promote these ideas to the general population. The UN has stated that these new global goals represent a new universal agenda for humanity. Virtually every nation on the planet has willingly signed on to this new agenda, and you're going to participate whether you like it or not. Some of the biggest stars in the entire world have been recruited to promote the global goals. There's a great cult video with lots of celebs you can wash your brain with, but there was also the Global Citizen Festival held in Central Park in New York this last Saturday, where some of the biggest names in the music industry promoted these new global goals. The feel-good event was timed to coincide, of course, with the annual gathering of world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly, #UNGA, featuring performances by the We'll Say Yes to Anything band with Beyonce and Pearl Jam and Coldplay and the usual suspects. And it wasn't just the entertainment industry that was promoting this new UN plan for a united world. That's right. Pope Francis traveled to New York to give the address that kicked off the conference where this new agenda was unveiled. So 17 is a lot of things, and we can't go over all of them here, but TruthStream Media kind of did a good bullet point, and they sort of did the easy translation of what they really mean with these 17 different goals. So, James, again, everything is linked. We implore people to go read all of these for themselves. I'm just going to pick my favorite of the 17 and mention it here. Goal number 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. And again, as TruthStream kind of notes, that means smart grid. That means smart meters. That means your fridge, the Internet of Things. It's going to monitor and track everything that you do. And it may seem neat because, I've got a good workout routine, or the fridge told me I'm out of milk, but it's going to be so much more. James.
Yes, and let me pick a couple of my favorites from this list. It's such mealy-mouthed, wishy-washy nothingness that, of course, you have to agree with the ideas of these goals, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Who is against that idea? But the question is, how do you do that? And I think the translation from TruthStream Media is pretty apt. Centralized banks, IMF, World Bank, Fed to control all finances, digital one world currency, and a cashless society. Hey, end poverty! Wow, and now we'll control absolutely every aspect of the global financial architecture and monetary system. Or goal number 2, I think, was also pretty to the point. End hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture. Translation, GMO. Of course they're going to roll it out. Of course, we need these genetically modified monstrosities. They're so perfectly safe. And, oh, by the way, yeah, the same interests that fueled the big industrial agricultural revolution of the 1960s are the same Rockefeller financial and interests that are funding the gene revolution of the biotech companies. But don't worry about that. Don't worry about all of that mess. It's all good. It's being promoted by the UN. What could possibly go wrong? Same crap, different name. I'm glad that a lot of people are already on board with this and already understand it, but please do help to spread this understanding before the global goals become the next must like a fashion accessory for the millennial crowd of support for, Facebook memes and things like that. That's what they're going to try. That's the way they're going to try to push this crap, and we have to come out against it as right from the beginning.
That's maybe the best setup for me to mention the last thing swirling around the UN is something that probably deserves a whole segment of its own. James, we've never waded into any of the Gamergate things together. I did one interview on it, but it's a huge mess to say the very least. And the way sort of Breitbart, their headline basically says, UN wants to censor internet to save feminist feelings. And that was in reference to the you suck and you're a liar. And those are Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn going to the United Nations talking about cyberbullying and all these sorts of things. And they've got a report. It's called Cyber Violence Against Women and Girls, a Global Wake-Up Call. And I think it's at least worth noting that even its would-be supporters have to admit that it's poorly written and terrible, and you can't really enforce any of that. But that's just another element, and that ties into those global goals of basically saying, don't slander anyone on the internet or we'll take away your internet license and you won't. Oh, internet? Yeah, we're working on that too. So, James, I think in closing, I think it's kind of funny. I was kind of dancing around the fear of it a couple of weeks ago when we covered the then upcoming Pope Fest USA, but you came right out and said it, and I'll sort of paraphrase it and update it here. If terror was real, they would have blown up the UN with every misleader in there all at once. Putin, Obama, Pope, Rouhani, Netanyahu, all of them, all at once. But it didn't, because it's not. And I think that's an important thing to note. And we had all of the fear kind of ratcheting up. Remember, James, September was going to be the end of the world, right?
Oh, yeah. Did that happen yet? Or maybe it's a couple weeks late. Maybe it's sleeping in this year.
Or maybe it's the slow frog boil, and that's the way it kind of works. And we'll shift, James, I think, for our third and final story this week, as we have been doing Good News Next Week stories all through 2015, every single week. And James, again, I got to give it to you. I think I sometimes try and dance around something, and then you come right out and hit it with the heavy stuff. You file this under Good News Next Week. Indiana passes law to legalize shooting the police. This comes from countercurrentnews.com. Is it ever legal to shoot a cop? A growing number of states are passing laws that say, yes, in fact, it is sometimes well within a citizen's right to shoot a police officer. While other states have ruled in favor of citizens shooting police officers in self-defense, they even note in this article, hip-hop legend Tupac walked after lawfully shooting 2 drunk off-duty cops in self-defense. Sidebar, that's probably why he really got whacked a little bit later, East Coast, West Coast hip-hop beefs notwithstanding. But while other states have ruled, as we noted, in favor of citizens shooting police officers in self-defense, in the state of Indiana, if a police officer initiates aggression without cause in someone's home, violence can be used against them in self-defense, including lethal force. The new law was drafted to, quote, recognize the unique character of a citizen's home and to ensure that a citizen feels secure in his or her own home against unlawful intrusion by another individual or a public servant, end quote. This should hardly be seen as profound, James. I think the article kind of goes on to note that these things sort of, as we've noted, oh, thanks for giving me back a right. It was never yours to take away from me in the first place. It's a veritable law of nature. That's our right to resist. So no matter what one does or takes from you, nothing can stop the innate right to follow our natural impulses of resistance. And the new amendment in Indiana recognizes this. It also makes clear that badges don't grant extra rights to break into someone's house and commit acts of violent aggression. James, the question is this a recipe for disaster?
Well, no. And I think, well, I would like to think that we don't have to clarify why this is good news, but for the heart of thinking out there, no, shooting police randomly, willy-nilly is not the answer to anything. It is not what we're promoting. But the recognition of the right, the natural law right to defend yourself and your home against invasion from anyone, even people wearing badges and hats and pretending under color of law to have some reason, whatever, if there's a warrant or whatever, it may be a different case and blah, blah, blah. But in clear cases where they violate your home because they got the wrong address or whatever, yes, you have a natural law right to defend yourself up to and including the use of lethal force. And this is just a recognition of that. It's not even, it's not that they're giving you some sort of new right. They're just recognizing a right that has always existed. So, I mean, to the extent that this is being recognized, that's a good thing. We'll have to see how this actually plays out in Indiana and if it is successfully used by anyone in defense. But at any rate, I think that's why this is in the good news category.
And hashtag good news next week is the way people submit stories to us, James. I think every week now you and I are both coming to the table with, I missed that. I didn't see that. So many great stories coming from all around the world and that's how this kind of open source, kind of crowdsourcing of news is able to work. So hashtag good news next week has a couple other headlines. Styrofoam eating mealworms might help reduce plastic waste. Jade Helm ends without martial law or Texas takeover. 2014, the least violent year in decades. Don't tell if it bleeds, it leads mainstream media. And speaking of rights that weren't yours to take in the first place, today, October 1st, Oregon becomes the third American state to allow recreational marijuana sales. Now, James, of course, all the other headlines people use, hashtag New World next week, and just a couple of the other stories that we're following. Drug enforcement agents fail drug tests, and that is hashtag Not the Onion. Canadian military explored plan to fully integrate forces with the U.S. And James, that was one I think you said you had missed, and thanks to our buddy at Brock West for pointing that one out to us. And hey, that CIA agent everybody loves is on Twitter now, James, at Snowden, buddy.
Ooh, the snow job continues. You can follow him on Twitter now. And I'll throw in another update from at John Loth, who's following the story about the Kremlin threatening response to U.S. nuclear deployment in Germany. So a little bit more of the ratcheting up of that. So we're seeing all sorts of movement on the Russian new Cold War propaganda rhetoric. And that's just one example of that. All right, again, New World next week. Hashtag is always full of lots of stories like that kicking around, more than we can possibly cram into any short episode like this. James, very good. Thank you for putting this together. Looking forward to it again next week.
Thanks so much, man.